Thank you, Stephanie, so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for coming out. It's really amazing. My second book came out in the pandemic, and I did a lot of virtual events, and it's amazing to have virtual people, but also to have lots of flesh and blood people here in front of me. And bringing a book out into the world is obviously very exciting, but it's also kind of a strange process because you go from spending years inside of the book, inside of your own brain, and then you have to kind of try to crawl out of it and think about and talk about the book from the outside. And over the past week, as I've been beginning to do this and think about it, the metaphor that kept coming to mind for me was that I'm walking Shay down the aisle and I'm giving her away to all of you. And it's a little bit of it's not a perfect metaphor, it's like a little patriarchal. And also I'm not convinced that Shay ever belonged to me, even though I spent like 7 years with her in my head and me in her head. But the metaphor does work in certain ways because she is kind of leaving me and going out to all of you and whoever you all introduce her to. And I guess if you're going to marry Shay, I should probably introduce you to her. To know Shay is also to know a place. It's a very real physical place, a small town in southern West Virginia. But it's also a mental and emotional place, a kind of psychic space that is being 15, 16, 17 years old in a tiny corner of the world that everyone has forgotten about, or maybe they've never been told. And you can feel your body changing, your bones stretching, but you're standing on a landlocked island. You know, they call the Midwest flyover country, but West Virginia is not even flyover country. It's like, don't go there country. Tunnel through, drive around, avoid this. And you can feel that distance. And sometimes you love it. The secretness of this place that is the only place you've ever known. The rest of the world out there might not even exist. And sometimes you love it, but sometimes you don't. And sometimes it scares you how time loops around itself and refuses to move forward. And sometimes you need momentum. So you go and you stand down by the railroad tracks. And the trains that come through your small town, they come from big cities and they go on to other places that you've only ever heard of. And they carry movement with them. So you go and you stand real close. You let the wind off the train lift your hair. And sometimes you put a penny on the tracks. And when the train goes around the bend and the only thing left is the sound in your head, you pick the penny up and it's still warm and it's flattened smooth. And if you hold it tight enough, you can grab some of that movement. And if you hold it tight enough, you can feel the whole world spinning and you can feel your place in it. The chapter I'm going to read from tonight is called Godstopper, and we're going to begin partway through it. Shay is 9 months pregnant, and her partner, Cam, and their friend Jonas are just graduating high school, and Cam has been doing homebound schooling through her pregnancy. And Cam and Jonas are in a band called Godstopper that's about to have their first show. The Pocahontas County show was a sort of graduation celebration in place of walking. Cam and Jonas didn't want to do the whole caps and gowns thing. Cam drove me up to Marlinton in Jonas's dad's Subaru that afternoon. I was feeling car sick by the time we hit Droop Mountain, and she slowed and took the curves extra careful. She rolled down the window and blew out her cigarette smoke. "I'm going to quit smoking the day Eva's born," she said. I realized I didn't even know that she'd started again. Jonas's dad's place was back off an unmarked dirt road. It was a whole compound of wooden buildings, some of them stitched together with tin roofs over walkways. Cam told me it was the last piece of what had been a big communal acreage back when Jonas's grandparents moved here. Jonas's dad wasn't home, but his sister Shoshona was. Cam left me with Shoshona while she and Jonas and the other band guys went to go get set up. I couldn't tell how old Shoshona was at all. She looked like she wasn't much younger than me. She had tits already and everything, but she kind of talked like a baby. Actually, she wouldn't really talk to me at all. She had a bunch of little toy horses, tiny plastic mares and stallions, and she'd wrapped each one up in a piece of colorful cloth. She unwrapped them and stood them up on a log in the yard and then talked to them, or maybe it was for them. I couldn't really tell. The thing about all the back to the land kids I'd ever met is their crazy confidence. Even the super awkward homeschooled ones have this solid, bone-deep confidence. It's like their parents pump it straight into them, while the rest of us just kind of fumble and doubt. I mean, Cam had a lot of sureness, and she wasn't raised that way, but hers felt earned. Like she got knocked down so many times, she didn't give a shit anymore. Shoshona acted like respect was her birthright. She said, "Mayhap we shall try again next plowing season, my lord," and held a yellow stallion high against the bright clouds. I wandered away. I was real pregnant by then, my belly heavy and clumsy and my back always aching. I could hear Cam and Jonas and the other band members in the backyard testing the microphones. I wandered into one of the sheds. It was so much darker inside. I couldn't see it all for a minute until slowly my eyes adjusted to the strips of light falling through the slat walls, honey-colored air full of dust that streaked across the long planks of wood like nothing I'd ever seen. Blonde wood striped all crazy with black or swirled with red patterns. The moment I reached out to touch it, I heard a footstep behind me and I jumped. "Tiger's eye," the man said. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" He was tall and skinny with a braid that fell over his shoulder all the way to his thigh. "Smell this." He bent and picked up a curled wood shaving and held it to my nose. I clasped my fingers under my belly and breathed in. It was a warm, rich smell. "You're Shay," he said, letting the curl drop to the floor. I'd already guessed he must be Jonas's dad, Elliot. "Cam has told us so much about you. We're very excited for the birth," he said. His eyes oozed kindness, but they made me squirm. Somehow hearing the word birth in his mouth and thinking about me giving birth made me want to vomit. It felt way too personal, even though everybody everywhere seemed to make my pregnancy public. Total strangers touching my belly at the grocery. "What are you having?" they said. "How many weeks?" Elliot showed me to a hammock under a willow tree so I could get off my swollen feet. And from there, I could see the corner of the stage and some of Cam's band's flurried movements. This was going to be their first show, and all of them walked with a thrill in their step. I could pick Cam out by watching her blonde ponytail and her camo pants as she moved among them. Elliot asked me if I needed anything, and I said I'd like a Coke, but he brought me a glass of water instead. "It's best for the little one not to have too much sugar," he said. His braid creeped me out, the way it knitted itself at the end, the way that it brushed against me when he bent to give me the glass. Once I'd gotten settled into the hammock, I didn't want to move. Cam came by and checked on me a few times. I asked her if maybe they had iced tea, and she brought me some, but it was bitter, so I poured it out across the roots of the willow tree. When the sun was touching the tops of the branches, people started arriving. Most of them I didn't know, but some of them had been in my class. All of them pretended like there wasn't a pregnant girl in a Valdar shirt laid up in the middle of their party. Johnny, the drummer, built a fire not too far from where I was, and people started cooking hot dogs and kebabs. Jonas came over with a rattlesnake he'd found dead on the road. He asked if I wanted some. "Tastes like chicken," he said. "Just watch out for the little bones." He looked like a miniature version of his dad, not quite as tall, and his braid wasn't as long, but otherwise just the same. "I'll stick with hot dogs," I said. It was dark by the time the band was ready to play, but Jonas had rigged up a whole network of stage lights, Christmas twinklers and glowing Halloween pumpkin bulbs and colored spotlights. I heaved myself up from the hammock. My left foot had fallen asleep. I jiggled it real fast. I wanted to find Cam and wish her good luck or break a leg or I love you so much, but I didn't see her anywhere. The air was thick with weed smoke and campfire smell. I had to pee real bad. I hadn't been inside yet, and I couldn't even tell which building might have a toilet in it, so I was off in the bushes getting poison ivy when Cam came out on stage. I was crouched just beyond the edge of the yard, clinging to a little sapling for balance, when all the lights went out and then just the stage ones came back, blinking. Jonas walked on and went over to his guitar, followed by Aaron, who picked up his bass, and then Johnny, who waved to the crowd and sat down behind the drum kit. They were all silent, and I wondered with a jolt if something had happened to Cam. And then the lights quit blinking, and a purple bulb streaked on over the microphone. Cam walked up out of the darkness, and the first thing I saw was her legs, smooth and shining. Even from that distance, I could tell they were shaved. And then my skirt, my black denim Walmart sale table skirt, and a cut-off black t-shirt, crop-topped to show a strip of her white belly. And her hair was down, soft blonde curls all around her face, her eyes ringed and her lips rouged just a tiny bit. There was a rush of sound like a wind through the crowd, and then her voice rang out over all of us. Hey everybody, we're the Godstoppers, she said. And then she paused and I saw her eyes harden. And I'm Cam, she drew her breath in, and I'd like you all to know that my pronouns are she and her. And then Jonas's guitar rose up and Johnny's drums lurched at us. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Thank you.
All right, I also wanted to thank Malaprops and also Mesha. I'm so glad to be here with you tonight. We were in graduate school together and been following you ever since. So, you know, it seems to me that Shay is really a novel for our times in many ways. There's a lot of things that intersect here. It really captures the personal impact of societal change and the damage that religion, big pharma, and discrimination can do. So I want to hear from you a little bit about how this story came to you when you knew you had this novel.
Thank you. I'm also delighted to be here with you. The way that kind of all of my books and Shay included come to me is usually through images, and it's usually something very small. So so far the books I've written do touch on bigger issues, but the way that my process works is I actually often don't quite realize that until late in the process, or maybe realize that is the wrong way, or I don't focus on that. So
Right.
The landscape and characters come first. Shay was first a perspective. Like I kind of had this image of a young woman laying on a couch. It's a scene that actually comes not too far below or before the scene I just read. She's home alone a lot through her pregnancy. Her partner Cam is still in high school. Her mom works, and so she's like doing her homeschooling at home alone. And so the first sense of Shay was, this young woman laying on a couch, staring at the ceiling for countless hours, feeling lonely and scared, and like in love and excited. She has this partner she's super excited about, and she's excited for the birth, but also like frightened. So that I just kind of stuck with that for a long time. And then the other pieces of it came through, but I tend to focus on the small picture and then let the big picture come into play later on.
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of feeds into the next question I have, which is that you do such a great job of showing us what Claire Keegan calls authenticating details, what the poet Miller Williams called the furniture of the world. I feel like this book's world is populated with really specific, really well-chosen things that build the universe of the story, and that also let us know who the characters are before we even meet them. So tell me a little bit about the choices of populating this world.
Yeah. So when I'm getting to, I think it probably is a result of like how I get to know my characters, which sometimes feels to me the way that like if you have a stray cat that is hanging out around your property and you're trying to like get any stray animal really, but There's a stray cat recently near my house in Durham, and you have to gain their trust. And that's how I feel like I approach my characters, is to spend a lot of time kind of quietly with them, not moving too quickly and trying not to startle them, and that with time they will come forward. So in the beginning, I try to trust my impulses and not overthink it. So if there's the image of a young woman laying on this like blue velvet couch, and the couch itself is vivid in my mind, I don't ask why, I just write it. And then just sort of, I think in all of my work, but that definitely with Shay, it wasn't written, the narrative didn't happen in consecutive order. So I had this character and I spend time with her, but like the arc of the story, the way that it ends up being set up in the book now, was something that came later.
Right.
So I just do focus on the details, whether it's actually literal furniture in the book,
Right.
or something that the character is interested in. And I try to spend as much time as necessary and not worry in the beginning about like, where is this story going? What's the plot going to be? Or don't ask myself whether a reader would be interested in it. Just ask myself if I'm interested in it. And then way further down the road, I can like work with an editor and figure out whether, you know, that piece belongs in the book. But I think a lot of it is just like gut instinct and the idea of like gaining the trust of my characters in the beginning.
Right. You know, you really show a deep understanding of the heart and the motivations of Shay. And the story is told through her eyes in such a close. I mean, first person is always close, but this is really close. We actually see her imagining how Cam sees her. You know, we don't get to know how Cam sees her. We get to know how she imagined he sees her. So tell me a little bit about that and what drew you to such a deeply interior depiction.
Yeah, it always felt like a part of this book, and I actually was a little bit intimidated. My other two books are written in third person, so there's a little more distance, and it's a little bit more like me watching these characters and then describing what they were doing. But from the very first moment that Shay sort of like visited me, it was through her eyes, and it felt like it was like I couldn't take that piece away from the book. So I either would write the book in a very close first person, or I just wouldn't write it at all. It felt like one of those choices that was out of my hands. And so then I just had to do the best that I could with that. And that meant for me, about 2 years of taking notes that were just little scraps of her voice. So before building any narrative, just carrying notebooks with me and like trying to stay tuned to the moments when I would hear Shay's voice in my head, and when I would just write it down and then kind of stitch those things together, because I felt like if I couldn't listen well enough and hear her voice and bring it, like translate it onto the page well enough, then the book wasn't going to work. And so I did spend like 2 years being like, I don't know, maybe this won't turn into, maybe I can't do this, maybe I don't have the skills, but I'm going to just listen and try to write her voice down. And then when I had both enough quantity of like pages of her voice, and then I also had enough time, I started to try to shape it towards a story. But yeah, it felt like for better or for worse, it was going to be like that close first person. So yeah.
All right, I think we were going to shift gears now, and I was going to talk a little bit about my book, and then you've got some questions for me. So
and then we'll have some time with you all.
For you all. Yeah, so my book is called Beware the Tall Grass. It was inspired by a 2014 NPR story that I heard. I was in the car with my husband, we were traveling, and they did a story on a research program at the University of Virginia Medical Center that attempts to corroborate the stories that young children tell about having past life memories. So if your kid comes to you and says, I was in World War II and my boat went down on this day and my best friend who was next to me also died, they would go and pull the news articles and see if they could match, you know, what had been heard there. And so that was just too compelling an idea for me to let go of. I knew I couldn't tell the story from the child's point of view because he's going to be really, really young. So the mother was the instant first choice. I'm a short story writer, and I thought, I'm just not sure I can write a novel. And so I knew I could tell the mother story, but could I tell it in as many pages as I needed to fill? And that's when I thought, okay, second point of view character is a soldier. So he's a young man growing up in Montana, and like so many of the men who got sent to Vietnam, out of factories, off of farms, with no real sense of what was about to happen to him. So Eve, the mother, is one point of view character. Thomas, the young man who becomes a soldier, is the second point of view character. And thus the novel was born in a short 8 years later. I found a home for it. So I'm going to just read you a very short excerpt from the beginning that is in the point of view of Eve, the mother. I've been here before, dreaming myself backwards among grappling hooks of light. True to the seasons, I've lived every word spoken. Did I walk into someone's nightmare? That's from Confluence by Yusuf Kamanyaka. Eve. Charlie was here. For a moment, my connection to him was visible. The cord pulsed with blood, then went still. The doctor clamped it, tied it off, cut it. A twinge echoed deep in my belly. He pulled the blanket over me, and the nurse swaddled Charlie. I watched the nurse through the glare of the fluorescent lights, the air scented with a strange mix of blood and commercial cleaners. Charlie seemed so far away, like an untethered astronaut, the thin cable connecting him to the mothership severed. This is ground control to Major Tom. I'd wanted this my whole life, but now I was wondering what the hell we were doing. Dan smiled at me, and I smiled back, feeling shaky inside. The nurse handed Charlie to me. I ran my fingers across his tiny hands. I unwrapped the blanket and rubbed his small belly. What's this? I pointed to a brown oval on the left side of his belly. Birthmark, said the nurse. I had a flash of sadness. I had imagined him as a blank slate, unmarked by life. I pushed the feeling away, looking into his small eyes, stroking his fine hair. May I, Dan asked. He held up his cell phone to get a picture. Really, right now, I said. I put a smile on my face and looked down at Charlie. Dan's phone pinged as people texted congratulations. We were connected to friends by the ether, connected to Charlie by blood. It was strange that in that moment, I felt singularly alone, thinking about my hopes for this tiny person, his small weight against my heart in a room pulsing with activity. Our brick bungalow was in the middle of a quiet street in Falls Church. In houses all around ours, families were sitting down to dinner, going over the details of their day. As dusk deepened outside the window, I held Charlie, admiring his face, willing him to coo. I counted his vertebrae with my fingers, silently making a wish for each one, 33 in all. 1, may he be healthy. 2, may he be free from pain. 3, may he feel treasured. I felt like I was the first person to ever experience this. Everything about him fascinated me. Charlie had a tiny nose, big eyes, and downy blonde hair. When he looked at me, it wasn't with the soft focused stare I expected. His gaze had depth. He looked like he'd already seen things worth talking about. Dan sat beside me on the couch. Look at his eyes. He looks like he's thinking of something sad, I said. Dan looked over and ran his finger lovingly across his son's cheek. We expect kids to be pure and innocent. A guy I work with from Russia said they say on shiazniat. It means he knows everything. Or maybe he just has to poop.
I really love that opening, and I didn't think about. I mean, I already was thinking about the sort of parallels, but we were both writing in some ways about birth and motherhood, and I thought I would start with a question for you, sort of related to that. You write about a lot of different kinds of love in this novel. There's Eve's love for her son. There is friendship love. She has a very close friend who's really struggling with abuse. There's her love complicated love for her mother and her mother's complicated love for her. And then there's also a marital relationship that is stressed by the past life memories that the son is having. And I didn't know if you wanted to just talk a little bit about maybe what it felt like to write all of those different kinds of love in one narrative.
Oh, yeah. It was interesting. I knew right away that I needed to complicate the story. And one of the ways to do that is to have these really vital primary relationships, these different kinds of love that were going on. And I think that I probably drew to a certain extent from some of my own experiences with my own family, the ways in which parents can see the same situation with the child completely differently and want to handle it in completely different ways. So that was part of it as well. On the Thomas end of the story, I also have a sort of a male friendship, a buddy that he's so close to that he would do almost anything for him. Although this doesn't reflect directly on the writing, when I was writing this, my mother, who is the most loving person that I know, had been diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. And so she was dealing with a battle right there. And it's kind of like you mentioned earlier, not knowing what you're writing about until long afterwards. But it's no surprise to me that when I came home from being with her and sat down to write, I engaged myself in different kinds of battle here as an escape from the battle that was, happening right in front of me. And somehow the horrors of Vietnam were easier to deal with than the situation that was right in front of me. But she was a complicated but very loving person. And so, I was probably drawing from some of that energy. But mainly, love makes the stakes higher, right? Yeah.
So as you mentioned in your introduction, the story is told through two different first-person perspectives, fairly large gap of time between them, but the chapters themselves are one after the other. And I was curious, I guess kind of from a craft perspective, how did you create that shape?
Yeah, absolutely. I wrote these Eve Thomas, Eve Thomas, Eve Thomas. I never, I just wrote it that way. I never looked at them as a whole. I never did any comparison. And what I was hoping for was that I was creating sort of even unconsciously at times echoes between the narratives, images that might show up or feelings or emotions or things like that, simply by writing it that way. I also think for me, it was just more of a puzzle and it was fun to do it that way. It was almost like writing with one eye closed. Like, I don't know what's going to happen, but that's okay. And so, that's how I put that together. And then, what I ended up doing is I consolidated some of the Eve sections to make them longer because again, I'm a short story writer and I wanted to write everything very short. And people were telling me, oh, let me be with her a moment before you go to the next character. But I had a lot of fun doing it one after the other, sometimes unconsciously having connections, sometimes saying, okay, there's a moment of quiet in Eve's story. Let's have a moment of quiet in Thomas's story. And so, that's how that was done. Thanks.
Yeah, I have one more question, which you've started to slightly answer, but you are a poet and a short story writer. This is your first novel. What did your love of poetry and short stories, you talked about, I guess, a little bit of the sort of challenges of the novel form, but like what joys and beauty did the poetry and short story writing bring?
Yeah. I think that the poetry part of it shows up in images, in images that work, that serve as metaphors, that gain meaning as they are repeated throughout the story. I think that would be where the poetry comes in. The short story part of it, short stories are so very intense, and we see people at a moment of critical change in their life, and we see important things happen. And I really wove into this narrative a lot of really intense relationship and personal and war moments, where there were a lot of things happening and a lot of drama. And while I'm not sure that any of these sections would function standalone as a story, I do think that that sort of spotlight, that sort of pacing that you get with stories informed this. And so, you know, I'm not going to give you really elaborate descriptions of the mountains of Vietnam, but you know, I am going to put you in the middle of some peak moments that might freak you out. So yeah.
Wonderful. Should we open it up for any audience questions?
Yeah.
Any audience, either virtual or in real life, if anybody has anything on their mind.
The virtual, yeah, so pressure's on the folks.
Yeah.
They're always a little slower.
Yes.
I'm curious if you had techniques to, since you're in your 30s, how did you put yourself in that teenage psychic space? And you had a younger person as well, just if either one of you had particular ways of finding your way into their hearts and minds, someone much younger.
Yeah. Repeat the question. So for anyone who didn't hear, the question is about young, inhabiting the perspective and mind of a person who's younger than we are.
Yeah. And I think, you know, and I'm also like, I've never been a soldier and I've never been a mother, you know. But what I did know was that the story was essentially about what happens when life happens in a way that you don't, when the life you get isn't the life you expected to get, right? And I know we all know that. So that was my starting place, sort of those people having their feet taken out from under them. And then the other details I just kind of imagine. I'm a huge dog lover. And I'm sure that I've probably held my dog in much the same way she's held that baby through admission, you know. But yeah, so some of it is just that sort of empathic imagining. Yeah.
And I used photographs a lot. So there were a bunch of different photography books, but the two that I'll kind of highlight are one by photographer Justine Kurland called Girl Pictures. That was it's a gorgeous book. She spent time with, I think it was her stepdaughter and her stepdaughter's friends. And they were in their teens. And another book by a woman named Brenda Kennelly called Upstate Girls that follows several families. And one of the kind of narratives in that photography book is a young woman who gets pregnant when she's 16, and it follows her for a bunch of years. And so I spent a lot of time with those photography books. Like I would sit at my desk and just let myself have sometimes an hour before I started writing, just drinking coffee and just looking at the images and just thinking about like they're just very evocative photographs. And so I found photographs and movies to be, I rewatched the movie Gummo quite a few times while I was writing this, and I felt, yeah, movies and photographs were the way for me to get back in touch with that teenage frame of mind.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions?
Ellen, how did you research the Vietnam?
So the Vietnam part of it, I went to a text called "We Were Soldiers Once and Young," that is a commander and somebody under his command wrote that. I talked to my uncle who had served just to get a sense of what it felt like to be on the ground there, and then reading soldiers' blogs from all points in history, because I wanted to get a sense of what drove them to serve, and also that sort of, I mean, over and over again, I would see this sort of claustrophobia of being, you know, in that position in some of what they wrote about there. So that's where I did that. You know, I really was interested, Mesha, in hearing from you about the drug use in the book and how you were able to so perfectly embody the physical aspects of that. The loss of time was really stunning. What did you do to get a hold of that?
I did not do heroin. Don't worry, Mom. For that research, I went mostly to fiction. So I looked at there's a book called Jesus Son by Dennis Johnson that deals a lot with substance abuse, and some of the novels of Robert Stone. And I would zero in on the sections where the characters were describing their experiences, and kind of like I did with the photography books, like just really focus on like a paragraph for a while and just try to kind of really look at the what was being described. And then I did do some research, more kind of nonfiction research, and in part of that I found this really interesting article that like talked about on a biological level, I guess, on like a physical level in your body, that what opioids, heroin and opioids can do to your sense of time. And it was a very technical article. And so the challenge was taking the technical aspects of that and then like bringing them into a fictional world. But it was fascinating to read about how it actually on a biological level can change your sense of time, and therefore can affect your decision making and your sense of like repercussions, that in a very literal way, the future is harder to grasp when you are in the throes of an opioid addiction. And so it was a combination of both like some fiction research to kind of get the embodied aspect of it, and then like more nonfiction research to be like, okay, what's actually happening in your body over a long period of time of having a high level of opioids in your body. Yeah. Any last minute questions?
Along those lines, how did you write about the pregnancy?
Yes.
Because you
I have never been pregnant. Similar, there are kind of no shortage, luckily, of pregnancy narratives, both film and written. And so I went to those, and I also used my sister as my secret weapon. My sister's a labor and delivery nurse, and so I would write sections and then show them to her and be like, tell me what I'm doing wrong, and she would. So that was my secret weapon, so thank you. What about you, because you're also
Oh gosh, yeah. My sister had twins, and I went in to see her right after she had twins, and the intensity of the lights and the intensity of just the look on her face, frankly, she was still shaking from the experience, was part of what grounded me in trying to describe Eve's birth experience. Yeah. And then the whole parenthood thing, I did look into those phases of development. So I made sure that the things that came out of Charlie, the son's mouth, were really unusual for that point.
Mm-hmm.
Would have been really unusual for that point in his development. So shocking in a way that would prompt the action, prompt them to explore and that sort of thing.
Can both of you talk about if you have any? So Ellen, you based your novel on a news report you heard about people who had some similar experiences. So the question for you is, have you heard from any people who have had those experiences? And then Mesha, you are setting the actions in your novel, very much in a real place in West Virginia.
Yeah.
And reflecting some of that, so we're going to give you any feedback as well in terms of how that presents.
Do you want to go?
The cool thing about bringing a book out in this day and age is that I think there are more ways to get feedback from people that you've never even met than there might have been in the past. So it's been a joy to both like kind of get messages on social media, but also to like look at Goodreads and have people say like, oh, this really chimes with some of my experiences. So that's something that I didn't even really think about kind of anticipating until pretty late. I think for me, I just stay so insulated when I'm writing the book that then of course the goal is to bring it out into the world, but I don't think about that until it's happening. So that's been like something over the past week that I've been like, oh wow, yeah, okay. This has a possibility of yeah, sort of matching up to some people's lived experience in a way that might be good.
Yeah, and I am hearing those stories from folks. I was sitting next to a guy at a book fair, and he said that his young son would tell him, okay, that they were actually on a road trip, and the son pointed and he said, that's the factory that I worked in when my red truck crashed and I died, you know. Much like many of the depictions that are, you know, that are documented, these are things kids say when they are 3, 4, and 5. And when they get to be 6 and 7, those memories fade. So that part is super eerie as well. So yeah, I'm hearing from folks who've had that sort of experience. There was also a huge article in the Washington Post about the same research program at University of Virginia. And the one thing the reporter highlighted was just the kind of shame that the families feel, how isolated they feel because they don't want to come forward because people will say, oh gosh, you're a crackpot, you know, what sort of things are you inflicting on your small child, as opposed to just honoring that this may be a phenomenon that happens. So that was interesting as well. That came out about 2 weeks ago. So I wrote to the reporter and said, you know, thank you for doing this work. You know, all these stories are important, and that there's not just one way to see, you know, the reality that we experience, you know, so.
So one last chance for the folks here, if there's any more questions. And then if not, I'll invite last thoughts from the two of you, if you want to tell us what you're working on next, or anything else you'd like to end up with before we move to the next slide.
Okay, so I've got a collection of short stories called the Home Repair Manual that I'm sending out to publishers, and it's all stories about home, sort of born of the COVID pandemic and all the time that I ended up spending at home. And I've got a second novel that I'm doing revisions on now. It's called Mapping the Sky, and it's the story of a young female astronomer who leaves her mother, who's ill, behind in Cleveland to go to Hawaii. There's a love triangle, a celestial discovery, and intrigue at work. So it's very different in tone from this book. It's tons. I said writing this book was like chipping away at a mountain with nail scissors. Writing that book was a day at the beach. So
Awesome.
yeah.
I'm at the point in my project where I'm still so kind of deeply inside it. That's pretty hard to talk about on the outside, but it is a novel that that deals with my father is here tonight, and his sister was murdered by her boyfriend in April of 1975, and I am using letters and documents and writing into that grief.